Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. So today I am joined by somebody who is doing some really incredible work and somebody who is not new to the advocacy space. So, Robert, welcome to the podcast.
It's such an honor to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. So let's jump straight in. So there was a video of you that went viral in Chicago outside of the Broadview Detention Center, but we'll jump in and talk about that here in just a minute. But let's kind of take it a step back. Walk us through like childhood, walk us through, what led you into doing advocacy. Just kind of give us like that backstory because you have a very impressive background and a very impressive background story that I think is important to include in today's conversation. So, feel free to introduce yourself, walk us through your background, walk us through, who you are, and then we'll kind of jump in and talk about different things. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And I'm a practicing lawyer, but what brings me to the podcast is my advocacy. And I was raised by parents who themselves were advocates and protesters, and they brought me to Vietnam War protests. Yes, I am that old. In 1965, I was a child, a small child, but have vivid memories of being at anti-war protests in the mid 1960s and the late 1960s. And I guess, one of the defining moments of my childhood was hearing and reading about what happened at Kent State University in May, I believe it was May 1970, where a number of students were shot and killed by National Guardsmen who fired on an anti-war protest. And this is the Richard Nixon presidency era. And I read about that and was deeply moved by what happened because some of those killed and shot were people who weren't even protesting. And those that were, obviously didn't deserve to be executed, killed, for exercising their First Amendment rights. There were reports that stones had been thrown at the National Guard. But the point is that it really defined, in a way, my childhood and my sort of emotional attachment to people who are less powerful than those in authority and protesters themselves and the First Amendment right to protest against what the government is doing. And that, we can skip these decades in between. And I don't have to be on a soapbox. I can stop talking, but that really led to what I saw in Chicago, as you mentioned, in Broadview, where the federal government was firing pepper balls and tear gassing and macing protesters simply for standing up to what the government was doing in our communities and to immigrants across the nation.
They say history repeats itself. I don't think anybody recognized that it really truly does. And it continues, on for generations. And it goes back, like you said, the 1970 Kent State killings by, like you said, by the National Guard. And it literally just continues repeating itself over and over and over again. So walk us through, you were dormant for many years. You raised a family and walk us through kind of what led you to going to Broadview that day, because obviously there's a reason that you attended because you see this injustice, right? You see what's happening to communities being destroyed and communities. Damn, I lost where I was going with that, but walk us through like what led you to going specifically to Broadview on that specific day.
Sure. And I raised up the killings at Kent State, so many decades ago because it resonated with me and you can hear it in my voice. It's still an emotional trauma that I went through so many decades ago as a child because these innocent people, some of whom were protesting, some of whom were literally students walking to class that were shot by our government. And that took decades to resolve, and it's never actually been resolved as to why the government fired on young people who were innocent. But what happened was that when I saw videos, I was out of town when Midway Blitz, that's the federal government's operation by Border Patrol in the Chicago area, began right after Labor Day last September. So I was out of town. I was watching videos, and I was literally watching the government fire pepper balls and other weapons at protesters. And the protesters were literally just wanting the government to stop doing what it was doing, what it continues to do. But what happened back in September was that Border Patrol was literally stopping people who were brown, stopping people who were speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, and literally detaining them based on this racial profiling that they were doing. What motivated me was to see the protesters, because we didn't have much video back then, although we got it later, of what was happening in our neighborhoods in Chicago. But the first instance of what I saw was literally protesters being shot at and shot with pepper balls right at the Broadview facility in a Chicago suburb. Soon as I got back, I went there myself. I had to see what was going on, and the injustices that I was seeing, the violations of the Constitution in the Chicago suburbs by Border Patrol with the racial profiling, detaining people and arresting people without probable cause, without a judicial warrant. I know I'm covering a lot of ground, but I'm motivated and excited, to tell you what was motivating me deep inside, to get off the couch, if you will, and to allocate time and energy and money and resources and my voice to both the protesters and the immigrants whose rights were being violated. But that's what happened by the third week in September. I was out at Broadview protesting.
And at that specific time, um, you went viral on social media. The video, I think it was seen like millions of times and it's still going to this day. I still see it popping up. People are still sharing it because it shows that we, the people, have the power, right? So let's talk about the right to due process. So due process is guaranteed by the US Constitution. Can you talk about what due process is and what you are seeing as far as like violations of due process? Because
Yeah,
obviously it's very, very prominent right now and it's a very high conversation.
right. And there's like, it's a weird phrase, due process. What does that even mean to a layperson or even a lawyer like I am? It's kind of an odd phrase that doesn't really resonate unless you have some kind of legal background or have otherwise looked into what that phrase means. But to go back to that viral video, so I was out at Broadview and there was hundreds of protesters, and the mayor had issued an executive order. The mayor of Broadview said you could protest at these times in these places. And we were absolutely within what the mayor said we could do, which was to protest prior to, I think it was 6 p.m., in certain areas of the neighborhood. And we were all out there protesting. It was peaceful. It was just what you would expect a protest to be. People with signs and people shouting and people praying, people singing, people just observing. But at the same time, there was hundreds of police officers out there. And we were allowed to protest until 6 p.m. according to the mayor. And at 5:30, the police started kettling us. And in this case, it was the state police. It was not ICE specifically, but I couldn't figure out what was going on, why they were doing this. And I picked up a bullhorn and I said, what are you doing? Where do you want us to go? Why can't we protest? And I was speaking extemporaneously through a bullhorn that wasn't my own bullhorn. And there was the journalist, independent journalist, Don Lemon, with his crew, who was filming that. And I think that at last time I counted, it had more than 10 million views across several platforms. But what I was expressing was exactly the point you raised, is that due process means that we, number one, we have a First Amendment right to protest, to, in the words of the Constitution, to, uh, you know, um, express our grievances to the government. And that's exactly what was happening there. But I think the due process in a different sense applies to immigrants. And what does not only an immigrant, but a citizen have? Because it turns out, shockingly to people that have never looked at it before, that the constitutional provisions apply to not only citizens, but to non-citizens alike. And what does that mean? It means that the Fourth Amendment says that you cannot be taken into custody unless the government has probable cause or a warrant. So that means that if you're walking around and you happen to be brown or you happen to speak in an accent, that the government can't listen to you or look at you and say, I'm taking you in. You're obviously need to be detained. I think you're a non-citizen. You're coming into custody. You're under my control now, and you've lost your liberty. Because in this example I described, which has happened hundreds or thousands of times and is happening daily, the government is saying that we can deprive you of your liberty, your Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment right to liberty, without a judicial warrant and without probable cause. So if you were breaking into a bank, for example, or holding up a gun to someone, boom, you can be arrested. There's probable cause. You're committing a crime right in my face. Or I have a judicial warrant. I'm looking for you in particular because a judge has said you need to be arrested. Without either of those two things, probable cause or judicial warrant, due process says that the government can't deprive you of your liberty by putting you in their vehicle and taking you to an ICE facility. So that is a fundamental element of due process, the right to be secure in our person, as in the words of the Constitution, to be secure against the deprivation of our right to be free, to walk down the street, to be at peace in our home without someone breaking down our door. We have that right unless there is probable cause or a judicial warrant. And that's probably the key point that I can make about due process.
And everybody acts like due process goes out the window, and it really doesn't, because it's been a factor of our U.S. Constitution for many, 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 years back. But thinking about that, you also went down and visited Camp Montana, and one of my favorite journalists was also there with you. But talk about your experience, down at Camp Montana as well.
So I've been inside Camp East Montana 5 times. I've made multiple trips to El Paso, Texas, where this weirdly named ICE detention center, Camp East Montana, is in El Paso, Texas. It is the site of one of the detention centers in World War II, when American citizens, Japanese, Americans of Japanese descent who were American citizens, I'm not making this up, were detained and housed in a facility at the same spot where Camp East Montana in El Paso, Texas is today. I went down there to visit a client several times in that facility. It's the largest facility that ICE maintains in the United States right now, but they're building larger facilities. It has the capabilities of holding 5,000 detainees. I think at its peak, it actually had 3,000. And I've been told that right now it's down to several hundred. It's not clear why that is, but that facility um, has been described as a human rights disaster in so many respects. Um, the food is inadequate, meaning that there's not enough calories to sustain a person on the quantity of food that they're given daily. The food itself has been described as horrible, in some cases, not edible. The medical, the ability to get medical treatment is inadequate, inappropriate, and been described as delayed. They've had multiple problems with disease in the facility. The water has been described as not potable, which means not drinkable. And they've had multiple people die in that facility, and one of them was investigated by the medical examiner in El Paso, Texas, and his report described that death as a homicide. I'm not making that up. That homicide has not been fully investigated, and it's not clear why ICE is not being transparent about that death and the other deaths as well, one of which was called a suicide. But on that suicidal death, um, the autopsy was not done by the medical examiner. ICE initially was silent about that death, and after a week, um, after a week, they did provide information, but they never provided the body in accordance with their own procedures, which should have gone to the medical examiner according to ICE's own documents. That should have happened, and instead, it went to an army base to be examined by an army medical doctor. Now, since I'll just continue on this story about this suicide at Camp East Montana. That there's been a second autopsy, but the family has not yet released the results of that second autopsy. So a lot of information there. I can delve in more, but the upshot of it is, with my 5 visits there, and the information that I've gleaned in the public reporting, is that it is a human rights disaster, and I will tell you, if I can go on, that I went there with Nick Valencia, who's an independent journalist. And when we came out of there, this was on my 5th visit inside. He came in with me as a translator. I don't speak Spanish fluently, and he does. And when we came out, he reported on what he saw and what he heard. And when I went there for the 6th time, I was told that I was banned and Nick Valencia was banned as well.
And we all know the exact reason why both of you were banned, because you're reporting on what you actually saw and what you're actually seeing. And there was an article that came out from The Guardian that specifically talks about psychological torture at the ICE Desert Detention Camp down there in Texas, like you were saying, the Camp East Montana. Dust was everywhere, covering people's blankets and clogging their airways inside Camp East Montana, the huge tent facility for immigration detention in West Texas. Said D, a young Venezuelan man who was held there. The air conditioning blasted constantly, keeping the living areas inside tents the length of 2 football fields at what felt like near freezing temperatures, despite the balmy weather outside, and rain leaked through the tarps, so people awoke on wet mattresses. Camp East Montana is the facility with the largest number, as you said, of immigration-related detainees in the United States, with a capacity of 5,000 and an estimated daily average of 2,505. Reports of harsh conditions, abuse, sickness, and death have accumulated since camp was erected last summer on the Fort Bliss Army base in El Paso. So you were talking about that, and also in like the same regard, the other one that is a really high topic right now and being talked about is the Dilley Detention Center. They've seen a rise in 911 calls to this detention center. And this is the same detention center that Liam Ramos from Minnesota and his father were also sent to as well. So, what other have you visited any other facilities, or kind of talk about that a little bit as well?
Sure, sure. And so, I mean, what's happening generally is that the government wants to stifle the voices that are talking about what's going on at these facilities. Why do they want to stifle it? Because what's happening is a human rights disaster, not only at Camp East Montana and El Paso, Texas, but the Dilley facility, which is in a rural part of Southwest Texas. And I did visit Dilley, but I was not inside that facility. I came there for a protest, and it was very moving because you've got Texas is this giant state and there's rural parts of it, and Dilley is in a very rural part. So you wouldn't expect to see, hundreds of people protesting because, you know, when I was there, many of the people had come a long distance from San Antonio, Texas, or other areas of Southwest Texas to protest what is happening there. Dilley is the facility where families are housed together. So where you have children and parents, they're generally taken to Dilley, Texas. I don't believe there's another facility in the United States where families can be together in the same place. And the reports from Dilley, from Congressman Castro, who is the representative governing that area of Texas, and from other people, there's so much information out there. There's children that have written letters that are now publicly available about what's happened there, and the similar problems at Dilley, as I mentioned, as at Camp East Montana, with water that smells, with water that's just not drinkable, and then mean-spirited, dangerous, and what I view as criminal behavior, where people need to see a doctor, but the guards at Dilley won't let them get to a doctor. So that's been reported there at Dilley, not a place that I've been inside, but I've stood right outside the gates with individuals that are aghast, that are, moved to come and upend their lives to try to convince the government to please stop doing what you're doing. The people that are there, most of them have never committed a crime. I mean, that's what's lost in this. And we think about this, the government wanting to detain 70,000 people. Well, 70,000, maybe like the old quote, is a statistic. But when you talk to a little child, a 5-year-old like Liam, whose life has been forever marred by what the government did, it really hits you close to home and becomes something other than a statistic. It is a tragedy. And I've been to protest at Dilley, but I've been inside Camp East Montana. I've been inside the Broadview, Illinois facility as a detainee because Border Patrol arrested me at the end of September 2025. And so I spent 8 hours in that facility. I've been to a place called the Miami Correctional Center. That's outside of Kokomo, Indiana. And I visited a detainee there. I've also been to the facility in Indianapolis, Indiana. That one's run by a county and is probably the best facility. And maybe it's because a county is running it with a contract with ICE. And I protested at other places, including the federal building at Minneapolis, Minnesota. Those are some of the places that I've been to.
And a lot of like what we've seen in Minneapolis in regards to, Metro Surge, I think is what it was called, Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis, the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. As somebody who has a healthcare background, the Alex Preddy murder literally did shatter my entire heart. Thinking about that and thinking about the lack of accountability and the lack of, or like just the blatant cover up of these agents, murdering civilians, thinking about that, what was your reaction whenever you heard the news of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and just seeing, kind of thinking back to whenever you were, experiencing like the Kent State protests and such, like you said, or, like I said earlier, history repeats itself, right? So what was your reaction whenever you heard about the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis?
Well, thank you for raising that up. I mean, what's different now about prior decades is now we see everything almost in real time, and sometimes in real time when it's live streamed, but we see video evidence of what happened almost immediately after if we didn't see it live streamed. And almost everybody has seen the videos of the two murders. And I call them murders because when you have an individual that shot in cold blood, that is murder. A police officer and an officer with police powers, like the Border Patrol does, and like an ICE agent, they have police powers. They can order someone to stop. They can take someone into custody. But when they exercise those powers, like we talked at the beginning of the podcast, they have to have probable cause. Now, we don't have to go through, what happened in detail, but if you look at those videos, no matter which angle you look at it from, at the moment that they were shot, there was no reason for a weapon to be discharged. And that's the bottom line. And you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to have police training. You don't even have to be a journalist. You just have to be a human being with a heart and a conscience to look at what happened. But what's more interesting and what's more timely is just this morning, involving a different incident, a ICE agent was charged with criminal conduct for drawing his weapon and pointing at a protester. And I saw that in today's New York Times. So what we're beginning to see, and I think what we'll see more and more of, is accountability, something that we've never seen before. And that is where ICE and Border Patrol are charged criminally for their conduct. And I will just throw in, it's nothing to do with what we're talking about, but on a personal level, I was thrown to the ground by an off-duty ICE agent. And in that case, the county prosecutors here in Illinois have brought criminal charges against that ICE agent for misdemeanor battery. Again, it's not on the same scale, obviously, as someone being shot, or having a gun pointed at them. But I was thrown to the ground by an ICE agent. He is facing criminal misdemeanor charges and being held to account. But what's happening, I think, more globally, at least in certain jurisdictions, is that state and county prosecutors are starting to hold ICE and Border Patrol to account. And in Minnesota, the prosecutors have gone to the federal courts to get simply the names of the agents that have committed crimes, because the federal government is not cooperating with state and county and local prosecutors to simply do an investigation as to the criminal conduct that ICE has done, in Minneapolis and around the country as well.
Thank you for sharing, everything that, you've seen and that you've done. And I'm left speechless because I don't even know how to describe what we're seeing in real time. Like you said, back in like 1970, nothing was live streamed. It's word of mouth. There were obviously like cameras, but they were like super like what we would consider now as like Polaroids, and they were very outdated as compared to what we have now. Everything is live streamed, like we saw with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and everything goes back to Minneapolis. And I used to live in Minneapolis for a year and a half back in 2017, and I left in 2018 or the end of 2016, and I came back in March of 2018. I used to frequent the donut shop that Alex Preddy was murdered in front of, which is called Glam Doll Donuts. I spent a lot of time at that specific donut shop. So whenever I wake up and I hear about the news of Alex Preddy, I instantly and sorry, I think about just the beautiful community that has sorry uh, that has just shown up for their neighbors in Minneapolis. That's the Minneapolis that I know. That's the Minneapolis that I came to love in the year and a half that I was up there. What they are saying is happening in Minnesota is complete and utter bullshit. Minnesota is a model state whenever it comes to policy, whenever it comes to organizing, and it has a rich history with Minneapolis specifically rising up against injustice. They're not new to injustice. Renee Good, Alex Preddy, George Floyd, Dante Wright, it continues going. Philando Castile. I was up there the day that, and this was the first time I ever went to a protest like this. I felt empowered. I felt inspired. You know, at that time, it was a mayor reelection. That was whenever Mayor Fry ran for his first election. Nakima Armstrong was running for election at that time, and I locked arms with her because that was the day that the verdict came down that they were not going to indict the police officer that shot and killed Philando Castile outside of the Minnesota Fairgrounds in cold blood, in front of his girlfriend and in front of his child. Philando Castile was a staple in the community. I was there the day that they decided not to indict that police officer, even though it was clear as day. You shoot and kill this man in cold blood. And that was the first time I actually felt the power of community. And that's what I'm seeing with them pushing back against ICE and pushing back against this injustice because they've seen this before. This is nothing new. It's a different part of a system, but it's a part of that same systematic issues that continue to run rampant in our communities. You know this as well as I do. That ain't right. Right.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, kind of jump in and talk about, what you're doing now, and the instances that you've had with police and et cetera. I don't know if you can specifically talk about this, but you were also you were assaulted by a ICE agent too, correct? I don't know how much you can specifically talk about that in detail, but if you can, I think that's something that we also need to highlight here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a protester so many times, not just here in Illinois, and as I mentioned, at Dilley, Texas, and other places around the country. But I want to go back to Minneapolis for a second before I talk about, some of my experiences with the government, federal agents. In Minneapolis, it is inspiring for so many reasons. First of all, um, I went there two times after the two shootings. And it's many people may not know, but Renee Nicole Good, where she was killed, is literally just blocks away from the memorial for George Floyd. So you've got this, geographical proximity of, these two seminal events. But when I go there, I'm inspired because you talk about the people, and this is really about people. So the Alex Preddy Memorial, and you think about, Bruce Springsteen's song, which talks about the street, where that happened. But being there and seeing, you talked about, the medical profession. I talk to people. That's what I do. And many of the people there, many of the people that were paying their respects at that memorial were people in the medical profession. And one of the individuals that I spoke to is somebody who works, just a half a block away at a restaurant. He's just an ordinary person and, talked about what happened after George Floyd and how have the people have to come together. But you go to a place like that, and it's inspiring because there were Somalis that would walk around with food and drinks. And these are, not wealthy people, but people that are giving what they have to the community, people supporting each other. Switching from that inspiration, which I get every day from people who, I see in person at protests and at memorials, like I just described, to people who send me text messages and emails and call me on the phone or bump into me. I was at O'Hare Airport recently looking at Border Patrol that was, reassigned to augment, the folks providing, for people leaving the airport and so forth. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. But being at the airport and people coming up to me and saying, are you Rob Held? And it's inspiration because their next, when I say yes, they say, I love your videos. I love what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. I get that kind of inspiration. But to answer your question, I've been unfortunately the subject of attacks, not to the extent that it's affected me beyond disabling me momentarily. For example, in September, an agent maced me right in the face, and I couldn't see him because I had a gas mask on. But the force of the mace from an industrial size canister of mace that was so close was able to push my gas mask off my face partially, and the chemicals went under the mask to disable me for an hour. And it actually stayed with me for 3 days because no matter how many showers you take, the chemicals just stay in your hair and in your skin. It's so hard to get it washed away. But so that was one incident, and just shortly after that happened, well, about an hour or so later, I was detained by ICE. So, and in that experience, I'll just describe what happened. There was a fence at Broadview which separated Border Patrol from the protesters, and for whatever reason, Gregory Bovino himself, and I have video of it, unlocked the gate. And you can hear me shouting in my video, "What are you doing? What is happening?" Because it made no sense to put these 40 armed Border Patrol agents in direct contact with protesters and journalists that were there. But that's what happened. And they said, "Move out of the street." And I was backing up quickly, faster than they were walking forward, until they began to chase me. And I was not able to get away because I ran into a barbed wire fence and I was taken into custody. Fortunately, it was non-violently. I gave myself up, and they didn't, maybe because they had sympathy based on my age. Were not abusive in any way, but did handcuff me with my hands behind my back, took me into a patrol car. And I will tell you that right after I got in the car, they drove a couple of blocks and it came to a stop. And they opened the door, and Gregory Bovino was standing right outside the vehicle. He looked right at me and said, "Now what do you have to say to me?" I did not respond to that, but it was a poignant moment where he wanted to show that he had control. Him and his, Border Patrol agents had control over me, and I didn't elect to respond, but I was immediately taken into the Broadview facility. So I can go on with other experiences, but that was one poignant example early in Midway Blitz here in Chicago, where I was pepper sprayed and then taken into custody and held for 8 hours in Broadview.
I think I read about like a similar instance where a pastor was detained, and I think it was in Minneapolis. And that story, it's wild. It's a very, very wild story. And just thinking about that, how do you feel about the current state of everything that's going on? So I know that I read an article from the Minnesota Star Tribune today that charges are being brought up against an ICE agent that allegedly held a gun, or pointed a gun at vehicles. He's being charged with two felonies, and the arrest warrants have been issued. But how do you feel about the current state of everything? And a lot of conversations are going on around reform of ICE, but it's going to continue going no matter what reform essentially happens. But what's your thoughts about like the current conversation around DHS and around, like the funding of DHS and et cetera? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security has a problem. And that is that while those that justify and support what DHS doing may be correct when they say that there are violent gang member aliens who need to be arrested and deported, while that may be true, we have thousands of examples and video evidence of the thuggery that ICE collectively has engaged in with respect to immigrants and protesters alike. So you have a combination of bad leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, you have insufficient and improper training, and then you have young, inexperienced agents, some of whom have criminal backgrounds that are attempting to enforce the laws that Congress passed, but they're doing it with leadership that has misled them. I can give you multiple specific examples, but it's sufficient to say that the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security has led their young and inexperienced troops to believe that it is okay to break down the door of a home if you think that an immigrant is inside. And that is not true. Our Fourth Amendment, going back to due process, says that you need probable cause or a judicial warrant. And the only way you can break down a door is if you either have that judicial warrant or you literally are chasing a felon who you believe is going to harm others. If you don't have that belief, you can't break the door down. And so, I mean, to get this to the broader issue, we need a change in the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. I don't think that Mark Wayne Mullen, who's replaced Kristi Noem, is sufficient. He doesn't have the background, the education, the traineeship, the leadership skills, or the occupational background to lead that agency. And I think that the way that Congress can exert the appropriate oversight is deny funding until there's specific changes in what DHS is doing. And it really has to start from the top, where you can't train agents or lead them to believe that it is okay to racially profile, to take people into custody without a judicial warrant or probable cause, and to exercise your police powers in such a dangerous and mean-spirited way. Yes, there was the individual that in the news today, the ICE agent who pointed his gun at protesters and is being held to account. But we have the more recent news where ICE fired a pepper ball and an 18-year-old college student lost an eye. So what do I think about what's happening, at the broader policy level? I think Congress is doing the right thing to withhold funding until there is systemic change at the Department of Homeland Security. On a policy level, I am somebody that wants aliens who have committed crimes and are a threat to our society. I want them arrested and appropriately charged. But as the government, you know, enforces the law and exercises the authority to do that, I want them to do it consistent with the Constitution. And so I am hopeful that with Congress exercising its oversight, that there can be systemic changes at the Department of Homeland Security.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I know we're coming up on time here in just a second, but thank you for sharing your experiences and sharing about your advocacy and sharing about, everything that you were seeing, because this is a perspective that is oftentimes left out of the conversation is from the legal policy standpoint. And I wanted to, again, thank you for coming on the podcast because it does mean a lot to me to hear, other than just seeing you on social media, which you've garnered quite a following, which I'm really excited to see. We've collaborated on a ton of posts and, obviously we'll continue doing that. But is there anything else that you wanted to share? How can people follow you on social media and uplift the work that you are doing, to hold our government accountable, which you would think it would be common sense, right? But obviously it's something that a lot of people lack these days. But yeah, is there any like last minute thoughts that you wanted to share and how can people like uplift the work that you are doing?
Yeah, I'm going to be straight. I don't fear the government. I have resources if I am ever arrested or I'm attacked by the government or threatened by the government, which I have been. I don't cower and I have no reason to cower. However, not everybody has the background and the voice that I have. And there are millions of people in our country who have been terrorized and traumatized and continue to be traumatized by our government. There are people that do not leave their apartment. There are people that are afraid to go to work or go to school. And I receive phone calls and messages every day from people who are affected by the government's conduct in a deeply disturbing way. And that is, for example, the call that I got the night before last, where an individual was detained and his family is at wit's end. He's never committed a crime. He's going through the judicial process. And I repeat for emphasis, this is someone who is now detained who has never committed a crime. It's not a crime to be in this country without documents. It's not a crime to be here without documents. It's a civil violation. And our government should be treating those civil violations as they would like when you get a parking ticket. You're summoned to appear in court. You appear before a judge. You can plead not guilty if you want. You can get a lawyer if you want. But that's not what's happening in this country. So I am deeply moved and propelled by those people who are showing courage, who are reaching out, and who are suffering by what the government is doing. My Instagram is RobHeld1, Rob Held the number one, but it's not me who needs support. It's the immigrant community, and it's the charitable organizations that are helping by giving resources to those that are in need, by providing legal support to those that are in need, and are standing up to what the government is doing. Because if there was ever a time for people to stand up, to speak out, to have solidarity with the immigrant community, with our neighbors, to educate them, to educate others, to read the newspaper, to write to the newspapers, to write and talk to our representatives. The time is now, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to say so.
Absolutely, Robert. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I, for one, am a huge fan of you, a huge fan of, using your platform, using just your knowledge and helping others. That is what we call community. So again, thank you for doing that. And please take care of yourself out there. I know it's really rough, but we'll continue amplifying and continue these calls to action. And again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate you.
Zachary, thank you so much. It was a pleasure and an honor to talk to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care of yourself.
Thanks.